On the day she is supposed to say, "I do," Isabella Carter is left standing alone at the altar after her fiancé disappears with her family's fortune. Humiliated and betrayed, she boards the first flight she can find, hoping to escape the painful memories. At the airport, fate brings her face to face with Damian De Santis, the feared head of one of America's most powerful Mafia families. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Rain fell over the docks like it was trying to wash away sins the city had stopped counting. The church smelled of white lilies and candle wax, and Isabella Carter had never hated a scent more in her life. She stood at the top of the aisle in a gown that had cost more than most people's cars, her fingers wrapped so tightly around her bouquet that the stems had left red lines across her palms. 300 guests sat in the pews behind her, their whispers rising like a tide she couldn't outrun. The organist had played the opening notes of the processional twice already, hesitating, waiting for a cue that would not come. Marco was not at the altar. Isabella kept her chin lifted, kept the smile stitched to her face the way her mother had taught her. A Carter woman does not crumble in public. But she could feel the cracks spreading beneath her skin. Her father, Richard Carter, stood beside her with his phone pressed to his ear, his knuckles white, his face draining of colour with every second that passed. "He's not answering," he muttered, and for a man who built an empire on real estate and railroaded through 3 recessions, he looked for the first time in Isabella's memory, afraid. It was her maid of honour, Claudia, who found the note. It had been slipped beneath the vestry door, addressed to no one, meant for everyone. Isabella read it once, then again, because surely the words would rearrange themselves into something less cruel the second time. By the time you read this, the transfer will already be complete. "I'm sorry, Bella. You were never enough to keep me here. Only your father's accounts were. Don't look for me." $40 million. Wired out of the joint accounts her father had so proudly set up as a wedding gift, the accounts Marco Alvarez had spent 8 months gaining access to, with a patience that Isabella now understood had never been about her at all. He'd courted her like a man falling in love. He'd knelt in the rain outside her apartment with a ring he'd probably bought with someone else's money. He had let her believe for 8 months that she was wanted. The church became a roar of sound, gasps, phones lifting, her mother's sob cutting through the marble silence, and Isabella did the only thing her body would allow. She ran. Not toward comfort, not toward her father, who was already on the phone with lawyers and men who did not sound like lawyers. She ran out the side door in her wedding gown, past the black cars lined up for a reception that would never happen, past the photographer who lowered his camera slowly like he didn't know if this counted as a moment worth capturing. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, and she didn't stop driving until the airport signs began to blur past her windshield through tears she refused to let fall. Anywhere. That was the only destination that mattered. Anywhere that wasn't here, wasn't this life that had just detonated in front of 300 witnesses and a live stream her cousin had, God help her, insisted on setting up for relatives abroad. She abandoned the car in short-term parking, gathered fistfuls of silk so she wouldn't trip, and walked into the terminal, still wearing her wedding dress, veil trailing behind her like the ghost of a future that no longer existed. People stared. She didn't care. Staring was a small price compared to the humiliation already broadcast to half of Manhattan's social registry. At the ticket counter, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Marisol didn't ask a single question about the dress. She simply asked, "Where would you like to go, miss?" Isabella looked at the departures board. Rome, Milan, Paris, somewhere with enough distance between her and the wreckage of her life that she could breathe again. "The next flight out," she said. "I don't care where." Marisol's fingers hesitated over the keyboard, glancing once more at the dress, the tear tracks, the ring still glinting cruelly on her left hand. Isabella twisted it off without looking and set it on the counter like a piece of evidence at a crime scene. "There's a flight to Milan boarding in 90 minutes, Marisol said gently. "First class has 3 seats left." "I'll take one." She paid with the black card her father had given her for wedding expenses, one last transaction before that world closed its doors on her for good, and made her way towards security, unaware that 90 minutes from now, in a different terminal of the same airport, a different kind of storm was already gathering. One with far more bullets in it than heartbreak. She had no way of knowing that fate had already chosen the exact moment her disaster would collide with someone else's. She only knew that she needed to disappear, and the airport, cold and anonymous and full of strangers who didn't recognize her face from the society pages, felt like the safest place in the world. She was wrong. But she wouldn't understand how wrong, or how right, for hours yet. Damian De Santis did not like airports. Too many exits, too many strangers, too many lines of sight a man could die from without ever seeing the shot that killed him. He had learned that lesson at 17, watching his father bleed out on the marble floor of their own home, and he had never unlearned it since. He sat in the private lounge reserved for the kind of clientele who paid to never touch a boarding pass with their own hands, flanked by 2 men whose suits fit too well to be anything but armour. Enzo, his head of security, stood near the door with his hand never straying far from his jacket. Salvatore, his cousin and the only person alive Damian trusted without conditions, sat across from him scrolling through a phone, with the particular scowl of a man delivering bad news he hadn't wanted to deliver. "The Moretti family confirmed the meeting for next week," Salvatore said. "They want to discuss the merger, formally this time." "The merger," Damian repeated, the words flat and cold, "is a marriage contract dressed up in business language. Say it plainly." "Fine. They want you to marry Elena Moretti, consolidate the territories, end the border disputes, make the East Coast operations bulletproof against the Russians." Salvatore lowered the phone. "It's not the worst deal in the world, Damian. It's a cage with a ring on it." Damian's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the anger simmering beneath 34 years of careful, deliberate control. "I've spent a decade building something that doesn't answer to the Morettis. I won't hand them my life to sweeten a business arrangement." He didn't say what he was truly thinking, that he had watched his mother live and die inside exactly that kind of arranged cage, smiling at galas while his father kept mistresses in 3 different cities, and he had sworn as a boy that he would never inherit that particular kind of loneliness, even if it cost him the empire itself. Damian De Santis was, by any accounting anyone in his world cared to make, the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard. Shipping routes, real estate holdings that laundered more than they built, a network of loyalty bought and enforced in equal measure. He was 34, unmarried, and rumoured, wrongly, to be incapable of feeling anything at all. The rumour suited him. It kept people afraid, and fear was cheaper and more reliable than respect. He glanced at his watch. Their flight to close the Miami deal boarded in 40 minutes. That was when he saw her. A woman in a wedding gown, veil trailing like torn cloud behind her, moving through the terminal with the kind of raw, unguarded devastation that made every head in a 50-foot radius turn, and then, out of some collective instinct toward mercy, turn away again. She wasn't performing grief for an audience. She was drowning in it, alone, in public, because she had nowhere else to be alone. Damian did not know why he watched her the way he did. He had seen betrayal before, had inflicted enough of it himself in the name of business, but there was something in the set of her shoulders, defiant even as her whole body trembled, that snagged on something old and buried in his chest. "Boss." Enzo's voice, low, urgent. "Two men, gate 14, ex-Bratva. I've seen them before. They're not flying anywhere." Damian's attention snapped from the woman in white to the two men drifting with practiced casualness toward the lounge entrance, jackets a half-size too large for concealment they thought was subtler than it was. "How many exits do we have?" Damian said quietly, already rising. "Two, both covered if they've done their homework." Enzo's hand moved inside his jacket. "Boss, we need to move now." The first man reached for his weapon 3 seconds before Damian's own security could react, and in the half-breath before the shot, Damian did something he would spend weeks afterward trying to explain to himself, and failing. He grabbed the stranger in the wedding dress and pulled her down behind the check-in counter with him, shielding her body with his own, because some instinct older than strategy told him that innocent blood in a public terminal would draw a level of federal attention that even his lawyers couldn't bury. The gunshot cracked through the terminal like the sky splitting open, and Isabella Carter, who had come to the airport to disappear quietly from her own life, found herself instead at the exact violent center of someone else's. Screaming erupted around them, a terminal's worth of ordinary lives fracturing into chaos, bodies scattering toward exits, security shouting orders no one obeyed. Isabella's ears rang from the gunshot's proximity, and for one suspended, unreal second, she thought she'd been hit, because pain was blooming somewhere in her chest that she couldn't locate. It wasn't a bullet. It was terror, plain and enormous, and beneath her the marble floor was cold against her knees, where the stranger had pulled her down. "Stay low," he said, and his voice was the strangest thing about the entire nightmare, calm, level, utterly without panic, like a man giving instructions for pouring wine rather than surviving an assassination attempt. "Do exactly what I tell you, and you'll walk out of here." "Who are you?" "Not now." His hand closed around her wrist, not cruel, but absolute, the grip of a man who had never once in his life doubted that his orders would be followed. He was dressed entirely in black, but for a dark grey tie, and up close she could see that his eyes were a shade of brown so dark they read as black in the terminal's fluorescent light, eyes that were watching the room over her shoulder with the flat, assessing calm of a predator that had done this before. Another shot rang out, closer, shattering the glass partition beside the ticket counter. One of his men, the larger one, Enzo, returned fire with brutal, economical precision, and the assailant crumpled behind a luggage cart. "Enzo, clear the east corridor," the stranger said. "Salvatore, get the car to gate 11, side entrance, now." Isabella should have run the moment his grip loosened. Every instinct that had kept her alive through a lifetime of careful, cultivated caution told her to bolt in the opposite direction of gunfire. Instead, and she would never fully understand why, not that day and not for weeks afterward, she found herself pressing her palm flat against the stranger's back as he rose into a half-crouch, physically anchoring him, some wordless signal that she was not going to abandon him to run through open ground alone. "There's a second shooter by the pillar," she said, low, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "He's been circling since before the first shot. I saw him near the coffee stand." Dark eyes cut to her, genuinely startled for the first time. "You noticed him?" "I notice everything when I'm scared," Isabella said. "It's a family trait. Comes in handy at weddings, apparently." Something flickered across his face that might, in a kinder light, have been the ghost of amusement. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a man doing math with human lives. "Move when I move," he said. "Stay behind me." They ran, her wedding gown snagging and tearing against an overturned chair, veil finally ripping free and drifting to the floor like a surrender flag, through a service corridor that smelled of jet fuel and industrial cleaner, Enzo covering their rear, gunfire cracking somewhere behind them until it didn't anymore. A black SUV screeched to the curb at Gate 11's side entrance exactly as they burst through the emergency doors, and the stranger all but threw her into the back seat before folding his own long frame in beside her. "Go!" he barked, and the car lurched into motion before the door had fully closed. Only then, chest heaving, blood roaring in her ears, did Isabella allow herself to look down and see the streak of red across the bodice of her wedding dress. Not her blood, she realized, after a full-body check that left her hands shaking, but his, from a graze along his forearm that he hadn't so much as mentioned. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's nothing." He was already unwinding his tie, using it to bind the wound with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this to himself before. "You saved my life back there. That shooter by the pillar, my men hadn't clocked him. I didn't save anyone. I panicked and grabbed the nearest wall. You noticed a threat before trained security did, and you didn't run when every survival instinct told you to." He studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her, perversely, unable to. "That's not panic. That's courage most men I employ don't have." Isabella laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound, half sob. "I got left at the altar 4 hours ago. I don't have courage. I have nothing left to lose," which apparently looks the same from the outside. The car went quiet. Outside the tinted windows, the city blurred past, indifferent to the two strangers bleeding and shaking in its back seat. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Isabella. Isabella Carter." "Damian De Santis." He said it like a fact rather than an introduction, watching her closely for the recognition that most people in his world couldn't hide. She gave him none, because the name meant nothing to her, and something in his shoulders loosened, fractionally, at that. "Well, Damian De Santis," Isabella said, staring down at the blood soaking into white silk, at the ruin of a dress that had cost more than some people's yearly salary. "It appears we're both having a very bad day." The safe house, when they arrived, looked nothing like what Isabella had expected from a man who travelled with armed guards and bled through silk ties like it was routine. It was a sleek penthouse overlooking the Hudson, all glass and steel, and the kind of minimalist luxury that spoke less of taste and more of a man who had never had time to develop any. Enzo disappeared to secure the perimeter. Salvatore made 3 phone calls in rapid Italian, his tone controlled but grim. And Damian De Santis stood at the wide window with his ruined tie discarded on the counter, forearm now properly bandaged by a doctor who had arrived within 20 minutes and asked no questions, watching the river the way a man watches something he doesn't entirely trust to stay calm. Isabella sat on the edge of a leather sofa, still in her wedding dress, feeling like an artifact from a life that had ended that morning and hadn't yet worked out how to end her along with it. "You should call your family," Damian said without turning. "They'll be looking for you." "They're too busy calling lawyers to notice I'm gone." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. "My fiancé emptied our joint accounts this morning. $40 million. He left a note instead of a marriage." Damian turned then, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply studied her with an attention so total it felt like being catalogued. "Marco Alvarez," he said finally. Isabella's stomach dropped. "How do you know his name?" "Because men like Marco Alvarez don't disappear with $40 million without someone in my world knowing exactly where the money went and who helped him move it." His jaw hardened. "I'll have answers for you by tonight, but that isn't why I brought you here." "Then why?" He crossed the room slowly, the same unhurried, absolute confidence he'd carried through gunfire an hour earlier, and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his eyes. "I have a problem," he said. "2 rival families want to force a marriage between me and a woman I've never wanted, to bind our territories together and end a decade of tension I've spent my whole adult life managing without their help. If I refuse outright, it starts a war that will cost hundreds of lives on both sides. If I comply, I spend the rest of my existence married to a woman who sees me as a business asset, and I see the same in her." "That's a horrifying story, but I don't see what it has to do with me." "I need a wife," Damian said, with the flat, businesslike delivery of a man closing a merger rather than proposing marriage. "Not permanently. 1 year. Enough time to stabilize the politics, buy leverage, and dissolve the pressure without a war. In exchange, I offer you complete protection. Your father's business troubles, your fiancé's debts, any retaliation from people who think you're an easy target, now that you're publicly humiliated and financially vulnerable, all of it disappears. No one touches you. No one touches your family. You'll want for nothing." Isabella stared at him, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. "You're insane." "I'm precise." He crouched slightly, bringing himself to her eye level, close enough that she could see the faint, old scar along his jaw and smell cedar and gunpowder clinging to his ruined jacket. "You have no fortune left, a fiancé who humiliated you publicly, and a family that will be circled by vultures the moment word gets out that the Carter accounts are empty. I can make all of that go away. All I need from you is your name on a marriage license and your presence at the events my world requires. Nothing more. And if I say no, then I'll have my men escort you anywhere in the world you want to go, and you'll never see me again." His voice, for the first time, gentled slightly, the smallest fracture in the granite. "I don't force people into my life, Isabella. I'm offering you a door. You're the one who decides whether to walk through it." She thought of the church, the whispers, the note slid under the vestry door, her mother's sob echoing off marble. She thought of the emptiness stretching ahead of her. No fiancé, no fortune, no plan, only the wreckage of a life built entirely around other people's expectations. 1 year, she said slowly. 1 year. And after that? After that, you leave with more money and more protection than you had before any of this happened, and I go back to running my empire without a war on my hands. He extended his hand, not for a handshake exactly, but something more formal, an offering. Marry me, Isabella Carter. I promise you safety. I promise you I will never let anyone touch you again. That's the only vow I intend to make, and the only one I intend to keep. Outside, the city lights were beginning to flicker on across the darkening river, and Isabella Carter, jilted bride, ruined heiress, a woman with nothing left to lose, reached out and placed her hand in his. Deal, she said, and felt the entire trajectory of her life shift beneath her like tectonic plates settling into a new and terrifying configuration. The papers were signed within the week, not a wedding yet, but the legal groundwork Damian's lawyers assembled with terrifying speed, prenuptial agreements and protective clauses, and a marriage license that would be filed the moment the ceremony was public enough for the right people to see it. Isabella moved into the De Santis penthouse on a Tuesday, carrying 2 suitcases that contained the entirety of what remained of her old life. Her father had wept with relief when Damian's people had quietly settled the worst of the Carter family's exposure. No explanation given, no explanation asked. And her mother had simply stared at her across the kitchen table and said, "Do you know what you're doing, Isabella?" To which Isabella had answered honestly, "No, but it's the only thing I can do." The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building Damian owned outright, 40 floors above Manhattan, glass walls on every side so that the city glittered beneath them like scattered jewels. It was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful, curated, cold, untouched by the kind of clutter that made a home feel lived in. "You'll have the East Wing," Damian told her the first night, leading her through corridors that smelled faintly of cedar and leather. "Your own bedroom, your own study, full access to anything you need. My staff will answer to you as they answer to me." "And you?" "West Wing. We won't be in each other's way." He said it like reassurance, though something in his tone suggested he was reminding himself as much as her. "This is a professional arrangement, Isabella. I intend to honor it as one." She should have been relieved. Instead, standing in the doorway of a bedroom larger than her childhood house, watching this dangerous, precise, impossibly controlled man retreat down the hallway without a backward glance, she felt an unfamiliar and unwelcome pang of something that felt disturbingly like disappointment. The first weeks established a rhythm neither of them acknowledged as intimacy, though it functioned like one. Breakfast together most mornings, because the staff prepared it for 2, regardless of whether either of them requested company, and neither wanted to be the one to send the other away. Damian, coffee black and scalding, reading 3 newspapers and a stack of briefings before 7. Isabella, still adjusting to a life without appointments to fill it, learning the particular silence of a man who said little because he had spent a lifetime learning that words were currency best spent sparingly. "You don't have to sit with me," he told her on the 4th morning, not unkindly. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Isabella said, "and frankly, you're the least boring thing in this apartment." That earned her the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. She began to catalogue those twitches the way a naturalist catalogues rare sightings. The corner of his mouth when she made a joke he refused to laugh at, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when she asked about his day and actually waited for the answer. The stillness that came over him entirely when she talked about her family, listening with an attention that felt like it cost him something to give. She learned, in fragments, about the empire he ran, shipping routes and real estate holdings that served as fronts for operations she chose, wisely, not to ask too many questions about. She learned that Salvatore was the closest thing he had to a brother, and that Enzo had served his father before him and had, by some unspoken code, transferred his loyalty entirely to Damian the day the old man died. She learned that Damian De Santis did not sleep more than 4 hours most nights, and that he paced the length of the penthouse's private terrace sometime after midnight with the restless energy of a man who had never once, in 34 years, allowed himself to feel safe enough to fully rest. She caught him there one night, 2 weeks into their arrangement, moonlight cutting silver lines across the dark planes of his face as he stood at the railing looking out over a city he owned more of than most people would ever know. "Can't sleep?" she asked, wrapping her robe tighter against the October chill. "Never could." He didn't turn, but he didn't send her away either, which she was learning to recognize as its own kind of invitation. "You should be asleep. Tomorrow's the gala. Long day." "You should be asleep too. But here we both are." He glanced sideways at her then, something unguarded passing behind those dark eyes before the wall slid back into place. "Careful, Isabella. Keep noticing things about me, and you'll ruin my reputation for being unknowable." "Too late," she said, coming to stand beside him at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I already know you don't sleep. You drink your coffee black because you never learned to slow down enough to add cream, and you've said maybe 40 words to me in 2 weeks that weren't strictly necessary. I'd call that a start." For a long moment, Damian De Santis said nothing at all. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it over the wind, "Don't stop." The gala was the first true test of the arrangement, and Isabella felt the weight of it the moment she stepped into the gown Damian's staff had delivered that afternoon. Deep emerald silk, cut with a precision that suggested someone had studied her measurements with unsettling care. "You'll be introduced as my fiancé tonight," Damian told her in the elevator, adjusting his cufflinks with the detached focus of a man preparing for battle rather than a party. "The Morettis will be there, Elena Moretti specifically. I need you to understand something before we walk in." "I'm listening." "Everything you do tonight will be read as a message. If you look uncertain, they'll read weakness in me. If you look afraid, they'll assume I've coerced you and use it as leverage. You need to look like a woman who chose this." "I did choose this." His eyes cut to her, something sharpening in them. "Then show them that." The ballroom, when they entered it, was a glittering theatre of power dressed up as celebration. Old money and older violence mingling over champagne, every handshake a negotiation, every smile a small transaction. Isabella had grown up adjacent to wealth like this, had learned its choreography from childhood. But this was a different animal entirely, a room where the polite veneer covered something far more dangerous than social climbing. Elena Moretti found them within 20 minutes, sweeping across the marble floor in blood-red silk, beautiful in the calculated, weaponized way of a woman who had learned early that beauty was leverage. Damian. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I heard rumors, but I confess I didn't believe them until now. An engagement. How sudden. Some things don't require deliberation, Elena. Damian's hand found the small of Isabella's back, warm and possessive, in a way that sent an unwelcome heat crawling up her spine. Isabella, this is Elena Moretti.
Charmed, Isabella said, extending a hand with a smile that gave away nothing. Eleanor's grip was cold, assessing. Carter, wasn't it? I read about your wedding. Or rather, the wedding that didn't happen. Her smile sharpened. How convenient that you found comfort so quickly in Damian's arms. Some women are simply resourceful. Isabella felt Damian's hand tighten fractionally against her back, a silent warning that she didn't need. She had spent a lifetime in rooms exactly like this one, learning to fill it an insult with a smile before the other guests even noticed the blade. Resourceful, Isabella repeated pleasantly. Yes, I suppose I am. It's remarkable what a woman can accomplish once she stops waiting for a man to make her whole. You should try it sometime, Eleanor. It's very liberating.
Something flickered across Elena Moretti's face. Not quite anger, something closer to reluctant respect, before she recovered her composure and drifted away with a parting smile that promised this was not over. That, Damian murmured against Isabella's ear, close enough that she felt the words as much as heard them, was very well done. I told you I notice things when I'm scared. Turns out I'm also decent at pretending I'm not. You weren't scared. His hand had not left the small of her back. I was watching. You were furious, and you turned it into precision instead of letting it show. That's rarer than courage. They danced once, near midnight, because the room expected it, and because, Isabella admitted to herself, only in the privacy of her own thoughts, she wanted to know what it would feel like to be held by him without an audience of assassins between them. His hand settled at her waist with the same absolute confidence he carried into every room. And for 3 minutes, beneath a chandelier that cost more than her father's entire real estate portfolio, Isabella Carter forgot that this was supposed to be a performance. You're staring, Damian said quietly. You're very good at pretending you don't care what people think of you, Isabella said. But you cared what she thought of me tonight. I saw it. I care what happens to people under my protection. His jaw tightened, the same fracture line she'd learned to recognize as him retreating behind the wall. That's all this is. Of course, Isabella said, though something in his eyes when he said it suggested even he didn't fully believe the words anymore. Later, in the car home, the silence between them was different than it had been 2 weeks ago. Charged, deliberate, both of them aware of the other's breathing in the close dark of the back seat. Thank you, Damian said finally, staring out the window rather than at her. For tonight. You're welcome. Rule of engagement number 1 for a fake marriage: never let them see you flinch. Is that what tonight was? Rules? Isabella considered the question longer than she meant to. I don't know anymore, she admitted. I think the rules might be changing without my permission. Damian said nothing, but his hand, resting between them on the leather seat, shifted almost imperceptibly closer to hers, and neither of them moved it away. The wedding itself was arranged with the ruthless efficiency of a hostile takeover. 3 weeks of planning compressed into an event that would satisfy both the Moretti's need to see the marriage made public and Damian's need to demonstrate, unmistakably, that he answered to no family but his own. Isabella stood in the private dressing suite of the cathedral, not the same church, thank God, but one just as opulent, while a stylist pinned the final adjustments into a gown that bore no resemblance to the one she'd abandoned in a terminal months ago. This one was ivory rather than pure white, cut close through the bodice, sleeves of delicate lace that Damian's staff had assured her was couture, though Isabella suspected it was simply the most expensive thing money in this world could buy.
"You look terrified," Salvatore observed from the doorway, arms crossed, the closest thing to a friend Isabella had made in this new world. "I am terrified. The last time I wore a wedding dress, a man emptied my accounts and a stranger shot bullets in my direction within 4 hours. Damian would never leave you standing at an altar." "No," Isabella agreed slowly. "I don't think he would." It was true, and the truth of it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. In the 2 months since the airport, Damian De Santis had proven himself, in ways both small and enormous, to be a man who kept every promise he made, regardless of its cost to himself. He had quietly dismantled the debt collectors circling her father's business. He had ensured, through channels she didn't fully understand and didn't ask about, that Marco Alvarez's name had become radioactive in every financial circle capable of hiring him again. He had never once, in 60 days of forced proximity, made her feel like an asset rather than a person. The ceremony itself was smaller than the media coverage afterward would suggest. 200 guests instead of 300, but every one of them a name that mattered in the particular economy of power Damian's world ran on. Isabella walked down the aisle alone, her father having forfeited the right to give her away the moment his negligence had let Marco Alvarez into their finances in the first place, and found Damian waiting at the altar in a black tuxedo that made him look less like a groom and more like a man standing sentry over something he intended to protect with his life. "You came," he said quietly as she reached him, the ghost of dark humor in his eyes. "You sound surprised." "I'm never surprised. I'm relieved." The word slipped out before he seemed to fully intend it, and something in his expression flickered, startled at his own honesty, before he smoothed it back into composure. The vows were traditional, recited in the flat, ceremonial cadence of 2 people performing rather than confessing, until they reached the final line, and Damian, who had reviewed every word of the ceremony with his lawyers, who left nothing to chance in any arrangement he entered, paused for just a fraction of a second too long before saying, "I promise to protect you, to honor you, and to never let you stand alone again." And Isabella felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with performance at all. The kiss that sealed the ceremony was meant to last 3 seconds, choreographed with the same precision as everything else in Damian's world. It lasted longer. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, and for a heartbeat, the 200 guests, the cameras, the entire theatre of power surrounding them simply ceased to exist. And there was only the warmth of his mouth against hers and the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. When they broke apart, Damian's eyes held an expression she hadn't yet learned to name, something raw beneath the careful control, quickly banked, but not quickly enough to hide entirely. "That wasn't part of the script," Isabella murmured, so only he could hear. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. Across the cathedral, in the third row, Elena Moretti watched with an expression of cold, calculating fury that Isabella caught only in fragments, but fragments enough to understand that whatever peace this marriage was meant to purchase, it had not been fully accepted by everyone forced to witness it. The reception that followed was a masterclass in performance, both of them playing the roles the room required. Damian's hand never leaving the small of her back, Isabella laughing at the correct moments, the two of them dancing beneath a chandelier of imported Venetian glass, while 300 guests applauded a union built entirely on paper and strategy. But later that night, alone on the terrace of the penthouse that was now legally, if not fully emotionally, both of theirs, Damian found her wrapped in a blanket against the November chill, still wearing the ivory dress, staring out at a city that had witnessed the strangest wedding of her life. "Regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "No," Isabella said, and meant it more fully than she expected to. "You?" Damian was quiet for a long moment, the wind pulling at his loosened tie, the city lights reflected in eyes that had learned, over 2 months, to look at her the way other men looked at things they were afraid to want too badly. "Only one," he said finally, "that I ever thought this arrangement would stay professional." The Vesper was Damian's, though few outside his inner circle knew it. A nightclub that operated as both legitimate business and neutral ground, where rival families conducted the kind of quiet, dangerous diplomacy that couldn't happen in boardrooms. Isabella had been there twice before, always as an ornament on Damian's arm, always watching him transform into someone colder and more remote than the man who read 3 newspapers over coffee each morning. Tonight was different. Tonight, 3 weeks into their marriage, Damian had invited her not as decoration, but, in his own halting way, as a guest. "There's someone I want you to hear tonight," he said in the car, tie already loosened, jacket discarded on the seat beside him. "A singer. My mother used to love this kind of music before." He stopped himself. The sentence amputated before it reached its ending. A habit she'd learned meant the subject of his mother remained a wound too raw for full daylight. The club's private lounge overlooked the main floor through one-way glass, velvet booths and low lighting, a jazz singer's voice curling through the speakers like smoke. Damian ordered whiskey neat, and Isabella a glass of the Barolo he'd learned she preferred without her ever telling him directly, another of the small, unspoken observations he'd been quietly accumulating about her since the airport. "You watch me," Isabella said, studying him over the rim of her glass. "All the time, cataloguing things. Do you do that with everyone?" "No." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, though the admission sat between them with a weight neither wanted to name. It was Salvatore who interrupted, sliding into the booth with the urgent energy of a man carrying bad news he'd rather not deliver in front of an audience. "We have a problem," he said in low, rapid Italian, before switching to English out of what Isabella recognized as deliberate courtesy. Marco Alvarez was seen in the city 2 nights ago, and he wasn't alone. He met with one of Salvatore Moretti's lieutenants. The whiskey glass stilled in Damian's hand. "The Morettis are working with the man who stole Isabella's family fortune." "It gets worse. Our contact says the meeting wasn't about money. It was about Isabella." Salvatore's eyes flicked to her, apologetic.
Specifically about what Alvarez knows about her father's business that could be used as leverage against this marriage. Isabella's stomach dropped through the floor. What could he possibly know? My father's business is real estate. It's boring. Nothing is boring when it can be twisted into a weapon, Damian said quietly, and something in his voice had shifted entirely, the warmth of the last hour replaced by the flat, dangerous calm she'd witnessed once before, in the moments before gunfire in an airport terminal. Find out everything. Where he's staying, who's protecting him, what exactly the Morettis think they're buying with this information. Salvatore nodded and disappeared back into the club's crowd, leaving a silence in his wake that Isabella didn't know how to fill.
"You're angry," she said finally. "I'm angry that a man who ruined your life once thinks he still has the right to threaten it." Damian's hand, when it found hers across the table, was tight enough that she felt the tension humming beneath his skin. "He won't touch you again, Isabella. I promise you that." "You keep making promises like that." "I keep them." His eyes met hers, dark and fierce, and, for the first time, entirely unguarded. "I have never once, in my life, broken a promise I made to protect someone I—" He stopped again, the sentence severed cleanly before its most dangerous word could escape. "Someone you what, Damian?" The music shifted, the jazz singer's voice climbing into something aching and slow, and Damian De Santis, feared head of one of America's most powerful crime families, a man rumoured to feel nothing at all, reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Isabella's ear, with a tenderness that contradicted every rumour whispered about him in rooms just like this one. "Someone I've stopped pretending this arrangement is only business," he said quietly. "God help me, Isabella. I don't know when that happened, but I can't undo it now." Isabella's heart slammed against her ribs, loud enough she was certain he could hear it. "Damian." "Don't," he said, gentler than she'd ever heard him. "Don't say anything back unless you mean it. I've had enough people in my life say things they didn't mean. I'd rather have your silence than your pity." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned across the small table and pressed her mouth to his, soft and searching, and felt the low sound he made against her lips as answer enough. Outside their private booth, unnoticed by either of them, a man in an ill-fitting suit photographed the exchange through the one-way glass with a telephoto lens, before disappearing into the crowd to deliver the images to someone who would use them as a weapon far more dangerous than any gun. Elena Moretti did not accept defeat gracefully, and she had decided in the weeks since the wedding that defeat was not, in fact, permanent. She arrived at the annual De Santis Moretti diplomatic dinner in a dress the exact shade of arterial blood, hair swept back to showcase a diamond choker that had once belonged to Damian's own grandmother, a detail she made certain Isabella noticed within the first 5 minutes of the evening. "Family heirloom," Elena said, touching the choker with deliberate, cruel casualness. "Damian's mother gave it to me years ago. Before you, of course. We were quite close once." Isabella kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. "How lovely for you both." "He never mentioned me." Elena's smile sharpened, delighted by the possibility of a wound she could deepen. "We were engaged, you know, before his father died and everything became about business instead of feeling. I sometimes wonder what might have happened between us if the timing had been different." It was, Isabella understood with cold clarity, a deliberately cruel fiction dressed as fact.
She had learned enough about Damian's history in the weeks since their wedding to know the Morettis and De Santis families had never been engaged, only aligned through business. But the seed of doubt was the point, not the truth of it. She found Damian an hour later on the terrace, away from the noise, his shoulders tight with the particular tension he carried whenever the Morettis were in proximity. "Elena tells quite a story," Isabella said, coming to stand beside him. "Apparently you two were engaged once, before everything became business." Something dark passed across Damian's face. "That's a lie, and she knows it's a lie. Our families discussed an arrangement once, years ago, before my father died. I refused it before it ever became anything real. Elena has spent a decade resenting me for that refusal." "Why did you refuse?" Damian was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city he'd spent his entire adult life protecting and controlling in equal measure. "Because I watched my mother marry a man she didn't choose, for reasons that had nothing to do with her own happiness, and I watched it hollow her out year by year until there was nothing left of the woman she might have been if anyone had asked what she wanted." His jaw tightened. "I swore I'd never do that to another person, or to myself. Elena wanted the De Santis name and the power that comes with it. I wanted something I didn't have words for yet. I still don't most days." "And now?" He turned to look at her fully, moonlight carving hard lines across his face, softened only by the vulnerability in his eyes. "Now I think I finally understand what I was waiting for," he said quietly. "I just didn't expect to find her at an airport, wearing another man's ring, 4 hours after the worst day of her life." Isabella's breath caught. Before she could answer, the terrace door opened and Elena Moretti stepped through, her timing so precise it could only have been deliberate. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, in a tone that made clear she hoped she was. "Yes," Damian said flatly, without a shred of diplomatic softening. "You are." Elena's composure flickered, just barely. "I only wanted to say, Isabella, that I do hope you understand the position you've put yourself in. Marriages of convenience rarely stay convenient. And men like Damian, men who've spent their whole lives being feared instead of loved, they don't know how to keep a woman safe from the parts of themselves they can't control." "I know exactly what I've put myself in," Isabella said, stepping closer to Damian, close enough that their shoulders touched, a silent, deliberate claim she made without hesitation. "And unlike you, Elena, I didn't need a decade-old grudge and a stolen choker to convince myself I belonged here. I earned my place in this marriage the night I helped my husband survive an assassination attempt. What did you ever offer him besides your father's approval?" The silence that followed was so absolute, Isabella could hear the wind moving through the terrace plants. Elena's face went through several expressions before settling on something cold and calculating, a woman recalculating her strategy in real time. "Careful, Mrs. De Santis," Elena said finally, retreating toward the door. "The De Santis name has buried better women than you for lesser insults." She disappeared back into the party, leaving Isabella's pulse hammering with adrenaline and something that felt disturbingly like triumph. "Mrs. De Santis," Damian repeated softly, testing the words like he was tasting something new. "I like the sound of that far more than I should for a marriage that was supposed to be temporary." "So do I," Isabella admitted, and turned to find him already closer than she expected, his hand rising to cup her jaw with a reverence that had nothing left of the cold, distant stranger from the airport terminal. Isabella. Her name in his mouth sounded like a vow he hadn't yet given permission to be spoken aloud. I need you to know something, and I need you to understand I'm not saying it lightly. Tell me. I think I'm falling in love with my own wife, Damian De Santis said, and it terrifies me more than every enemy I've ever made combined. The attack came 11 days later, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the parking garage beneath a boutique where Isabella had gone to be fitted for a gown she'd need for the following month's charity gala. She noticed the black sedan first, parked too close to the exit, engine running, a detail that snagged against the instincts she'd sharpened since the airport. She had just enough time to reach for the panic button Damian's security team had installed in her purse before two men emerged from the sedan, moving with the same practiced, deliberate calm she remembered from the terminal months ago. Mrs. De Santis, the taller one said, not unkindly, which was somehow more frightening than aggression would have been. You'll come with us quietly, and no one gets hurt. I don't think so, Isabella said, and pressed the panic button hard enough to bruise her own thumb. What happened next unfolded in fragments she would replay for weeks afterward. Her own scream, sharp and deliberate, designed to draw attention rather than beg for mercy. The boutique security guard, a retired police officer Damian had personally vetted, emerging with a weapon drawn. The screech of tyres as Damian's security detail alerted the instant her panic signal fired arrived within 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. By the time Damian himself arrived, breathless in a way she'd never seen him, tie discarded, the two assailants were already restrained on the garage floor, and Isabella was sitting on the boutique's curb, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from somewhere, hands shaking with the particular delayed terror of danger that had already passed. Isabella. He dropped to his knees in front of her, hands framing her face with a desperation that stripped away every ounce of the controlled, distant man the world knew him as. Are you hurt? Tell me the truth. I'm fine. Scared, but fine. Her voice wavered, despite her best effort at steadiness. They knew my name, Damian. They knew exactly where I'd be. Something in his face went very still and very dangerous. Someone told them your schedule. Who would do that? Someone with access to my household. His voice had dropped into a register she'd never heard from him, low and lethal. A man calculating exactly how many ways he intended to make someone regret their choices. Someone I trusted enough to know your movements. He gathered her into his arms then, carrying her to the car rather than allowing her to walk, an act of tenderness so at odds with the violence simmering beneath his composure that Isabella found herself crying, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming, disorienting relief of being held by someone who looked, in that moment, entirely undone by the thought of losing her. I should have had more security on you, Damian said in the car, his arms still wrapped around her, his mouth pressed against her hair. I should never have let you go anywhere without Enzo. This is my fault. It's not your fault. It's the fault of whoever hired those men. I will find them, Damian said, and the promise in his voice carried a weight that made Isabella shiver, not from fear of him, but from the ferocity of a man who had just discovered exactly how much he had to lose. I will find every single person connected to this, and I will make certain they understand, in terms they cannot misunderstand, that touching you is the single greatest mistake anyone could ever make against me." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Damian did not retreat to the West Wing. He sat with her in the East Wing's living room, a fire crackling despite the mild autumn weather, refusing to leave her sight, even as his phone buzzed with a dozen urgent calls he ignored entirely. "Talk to me," Isabella said quietly, curled against his side, his arm wrapped around her shoulders in a way that felt less like protection now, and more like a man who simply could not bear to have any distance between them. "Tell me something real, not business. Something about you." Damian was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "My father used to say that men in our world don't get to keep the things they love," he said finally. "That love is a liability, a weakness someone will always find and exploit." I believed him for most of my life. I built an empire on believing him. His arm tightened around her. "And then I met a woman in a wedding dress who noticed an assassin before my own trained security did. And I have spent every day since then discovering how wrong my father was, and how much I don't care that believing him would probably have kept me safer." "Damian, I need you to survive this, Isabella. Whatever comes next, whoever ordered today, whatever war it starts, I need you to survive it. I don't know how to lose you. I never planned for the possibility of wanting someone enough that losing them would break something in me I can't repair." Isabella turned in his arms and pressed her mouth to his, slow and certain, an answer more honest than any words could offer. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing like they'd run a great distance to arrive at this single quiet moment. "I'm not going anywhere," Isabella whispered. "Not without you fighting beside me. That's not how this works anymore." Damian's investigation into the household leak moved with brutal efficiency over the following days, but it was the story he finally told her, unprompted, unravelled slowly over a bottle of wine on a night when the penthouse felt too quiet to bear silence, that changed the shape of everything Isabella thought she understood about him. "I was 17, he began, staring into the fire rather than at her, as though the memory required distance to survive telling. "My father built this empire from nothing, came over from Sicily with a single suitcase and turned violence into an art form respectable enough that senators took his calls. But respect, in our world, is a currency that runs out the moment someone decides you're weak enough to challenge. What happened? The Bianchi family decided he'd grown soft. Too many years of legitimate business, not enough bloodshed to remind people why the De Santis name still mattered." Damian's hand tightened around his glass. "They came to the house on a Sunday. I remember it was a Sunday because my mother had made dinner and the whole house smelled like rosemary and bread, and I was upstairs arguing with Salvatore about a football game when I heard the first shot." Isabella reached for his hand, and he let her take it, his fingers cold despite the fire's warmth. "I found my father on the kitchen floor. My mother was screaming, trying to stop the bleeding with a dish towel, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that has never left me, that I was going to spend the rest of my life making certain no one ever walked into my house and did that again." His voice had gone flat, the careful control of a man reciting facts rather than reliving grief. "He died in the hospital 4 hours later.
I became the head of this family at 17 years old, before I'd even finished high school, because there was no one else left standing who the organization would follow. And your mother? Something in Damian's face cracked, just slightly. She never recovered. Not really. She lived another 6 years, but she was a ghost long before her body finally gave out. Grief and guilt eating her alive, because she believed, wrongly, that if she'd fought harder, been faster, done something differently, my father would still be alive. She used to sit in that same chair, he gestured toward an armchair by the window, and stare at nothing for hours. I would come home from meetings that required me to order things a 17-year-old should never have to order, and I'd find her exactly where I'd left her that morning, unmoved, unreachable. Damian, I'm so sorry. I don't tell people this, he said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes raw in a way she'd never witnessed. Not Salvatore, not Enzo, no one outside the family who was actually there. I've spent 17 years building a reputation for being unfeeling, because feeling anything, in my world, is an invitation for someone to use it against you. My father's love for my mother made him careless. I swore I'd never make that same mistake. And now? And now I've fallen in love with a woman I met while bleeding from a bullet graze, and every instinct I've spent half my life cultivating is screaming at me to protect myself by pushing you away, and I find I don't have the will to listen to any of it. He brought her hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss against her knuckles with a tenderness that made her chest ache. You asked me once what rules of engagement look like for a marriage like ours. I think the truth is, I stopped following any rules the moment you noticed that assassin by the pillar. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until tonight. Isabella moved closer, curling into the warmth of him, feeling the steady thud of his heart beneath her palm. Your mother didn't die because she loved your father too much, Damian. She died because grief is heavier than any one person should have to carry alone, and no one helped her carry it. That's not a warning against love. That's a warning against facing loss without someone beside you. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. Nothing about this is simple. But I refuse to believe that loving someone is the mistake that killed your parents. I think the mistake was believing love had to be carried in silence. She tilted her face up to meet his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Damian. Whatever this becomes, whatever war is coming for us, I want to carry it with you, not instead of you, not behind you, with you. Damian De Santis, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, a boy who had buried his father at 17 and watched his mother disappear into grief for 6 long years afterward, pressed his forehead against Isabella's, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to simply be held. I love you, he said quietly. The words unpracticed and rough, like a language he was only now learning to speak. I don't know how to do this well. I don't know how to be soft, without feeling like I'm handing someone a weapon to use against me. But I love you, Isabella Carter, and I am done pretending this marriage is anything less than the truest thing I've ever built. I love you too, Isabella whispered back, and felt the words settle into her chest like something finally, permanently coming home. The name that broke everything open arrived 3 days later, delivered by Salvatore with the grim urgency of a man who understood he was about to detonate something neither Damian nor Isabella were prepared for.
We got the identity of the men who attacked Isabella at the boutique, Salvatore said, spreading photographs across the study's desk. They're not Moretti soldiers. They're freelancers, hired through 3 layers of shell accounts to obscure the paper trail. But we traced the money back far enough to find the original source. Who? Damian said, his voice already carrying the flat, dangerous calm that Isabella had learned preceded violence.
Marco Alvarez. Isabella's stomach turned to ice. Marco ordered an attack on me? Why? He already took everything he wanted from me. What could he possibly gain from hurting me now? Salvatore's expression tightened further. That's the part that doesn't add up. Not until you look at who Alvarez has been meeting with since he disappeared with your family's money. He slid another photograph across the desk. Marco, thinner than Isabella remembered, seated across a restaurant table from a man she recognized instantly. That's my father's business partner, Isabella said slowly, her mind racing to reassemble a puzzle she was only now realizing had been assembled around her for far longer than she understood. Franklin Weiss. He and my father built half their real estate portfolio together. Franklin Weiss has been quietly liquidating shared assets with your father's company for the past 8 months, Salvatore said. Right around the time Marco Alvarez began courting you. The room went very still. Isabella felt the floor tilt beneath her, an old and familiar humiliation curdling into something new and far more dangerous. You're saying this was never about me, she said slowly. You're saying Marco was hired, that my entire relationship, my engagement, my wedding, all of it was engineered by my father's own business partner to drain the Carter fortune while everyone believed it was simple heartbreak. I believe, Damian said, his voice low and lethal, that Franklin Weiss orchestrated your fiancé's betrayal to gain sole control of your father's company. And when your marriage to me threatened to expose the financial trail leading back to him, because my people have access to information his lawyers never anticipated, he panicked and hired Alvarez to eliminate the one person capable of connecting the pieces before it was too late. You. Isabella's hands were shaking. My father trusted Franklin for 20 years. Your father trusted a man who was planning his ruin for at least 8 months, possibly longer, Damian said, gentler now, reaching for her hand across the desk. I'm sorry, Isabella. I know this isn't the truth you wanted. No, Isabella said, and to her own surprise, found something like clarity settling over the shock. This is better than the truth I had. For months I thought I wasn't enough to be loved honestly, that Marco simply never cared about me, that I was too easy to discard. But this, she gestured at the photographs, this means it was never about my worth at all. It was a conspiracy I never had a chance of seeing, engineered by people far more calculating than I ever suspected existed in my own family's orbit. That doesn't make it hurt less, Damian said quietly. No, but it changes what I'm angry about. Isabella's jaw set with a determination Damian recognized, with something like pride, as the same steel that had noticed an assassin in an airport terminal months ago. I want to help you take Franklin Weiss apart, not for revenge, for my father, who trusted a man who was planning to destroy him the entire time. And for whatever woman Marco Alvarez decides to target next, unless someone stops him permanently. That's dangerous, Isabella. Franklin Weiss has resources, and if he's willing to hire an assassination attempt against you once, He'll try again the moment he realizes we know. Then we make certain he never gets the chance, Isabella said. I know my father's business, Damian. I know Franklin Weiss's patterns, his weaknesses, the small vanities he's spent 20 years hiding behind respectability. Let me help you end this the way we ended the airport, together, not with me hiding behind you while you take all the risk. Damian studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud kindling behind the dark of his eyes. You continue to surprise me, he said finally.
Every single day, Isabella Carter De Santis finds a new way to prove she was never meant to be a victim in anyone's story. Then let's make sure Franklin Weiss learns that lesson personally, Isabella said, and reached for the photographs with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The plan Damian's people assembled required patience neither of them possessed in abundance, weeks of quiet surveillance, financial forensics conducted by Salvatore's most trusted analyst, careful cultivation of a paper trail solid enough to destroy Franklin Weiss without triggering a war the Morettis could exploit. In the spaces between the danger, something softer continued to grow, stubborn and unhurried, the way flowers find their way through concrete. It was on one of those in-between evenings, walking back from a restaurant Damian had insisted on taking her to, despite his security detail's objections, that the sky opened without warning, a sudden autumn downpour that sent pedestrians scattering for cover. Damian pulled her beneath the awning of a closed bookshop, both of them soaked through within seconds, laughing, an actual, unguarded laugh from a man Isabella had once believed incapable of the sound. "Some bodyguard I am," Enzo muttered from a discreet distance, holding an umbrella that had arrived approximately 4 seconds too late to matter. "We're fine, Enzo," Damian called back, though his eyes never left Isabella's face, rain plastering dark hair against his forehead, water dripping from his jaw in a way that should not have been as devastating as it was. "You look ridiculous," Isabella said, breathless with laughter. "You look like you're about to catch a cold, and I find I care far too much about that possibility." He reached up, brushing rain-soaked hair back from her face with a tenderness that stilled her laughter into something quieter, more charged. "Isabella, yes? I've spent 34 years believing I didn't deserve the kind of happiness other people take for granted. That men in my position pay for power with everything soft in themselves, and there's no getting it back once it's spent." His hand cupped her jaw, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You've spent 5 months proving me wrong about nearly everything I believed about myself. And I don't know how to thank you for that, except to tell you the truth. Standing here, soaked to the skin, looking like an idiot in front of my own security detail." "What truth?" "That I don't want this to end when the year is over," Damian said. "I don't want a marriage of convenience that expires on a calendar. I want a real marriage, Isabella. I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I meant every vow I made at that altar, even the ones I wasn't supposed to mean yet." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, rain running down both their faces, the city blurred and glittering around them like something out of a film neither of them had auditioned for, but had somehow, impossibly, ended up starring in together. "Damian De Santis," she said, "are you proposing to your own wife?" "I believe I am," he said, the ghost of a smile finally breaking free, unguarded and boyish in a way that transformed his entire face. "It seemed only fair, given that our first wedding was mostly business. Ask me properly, then. Something in his expression sobered, deepened. He reached into his jacket pocket, soaked through, ruined by the rain, but his hand emerged holding a small velvet box regardless, as though he had been carrying it for days, waiting for the right, unplanned moment to arrive. Isabella Carter De Santis, he said, opening the box to reveal a ring far simpler than anything the world would expect from a man of his wealth. A single sapphire, deep blue, chosen, she would learn later, because it matched the colour of the sky the night they danced at their wedding. Will you stay married to me? Not for 1 year, not for protection or convenience or politics, for the rest of whatever time we're given, because I have never once in my life wanted anything the way I want to keep waking up beside you. Isabella laughed, tears mixing indistinguishably with rain on her cheeks. Yes, God, yes, Damian, of course, yes. He kissed her then, rain soaking through every layer of careful composure either of them had ever built. Enzo's forgotten umbrella abandoned entirely on the wet pavement, and for the first time since the church door had slammed shut behind her fleeing figure months ago, Isabella Carter felt entirely, unreservedly certain that she had finally found the place she was always meant to land. Neither of them noticed the black car idling across the street, windows tinted, a figure inside watching the entire scene unfold with cold, calculating patience, already dialing a number that would set the next, far more dangerous phase of their story into motion. Franklin Weiss discovered the forensic trail closing around him on a Thursday morning, delivered not by Damian's people, but by his own increasingly desperate lawyers, who informed him in careful, frightened language that federal auditors had begun asking questions about accounts he had believed permanently buried. He did not panic quietly. Men who had spent 20 years building a respectable facade rarely did. Instead, he made a call to Salvatore Moretti, not Elena, but her father, the family patriarch whose ambitions ran deeper and colder than his daughter's wounded pride, and proposed an alliance built on mutual desperation. De Santis is unravelling my life, Franklin said, his voice tight with the particular fury of a man who had believed himself untouchable. If he exposes what I've built with Alvarez, I lose everything, and the trail leads close enough to your organization's laundering operations that you'll lose considerably more than money. What do you propose? Salvatore Moretti asked, his tone carrying the flat patience of a man who had outlived a dozen desperate schemers exactly like Franklin Weiss. Take the girl, Franklin said. Not to hurt her. Your daughter tried that, and it accomplished nothing but making De Santis more dangerous. Take her to force his hand. He'll trade anything for her safety, including his silence about accounts that could destroy both of us. The silence that followed carried the particular weight of a man who understood he was being asked to gamble everything on a single, desperate roll of the dice, but who had also spent a decade watching Damian De Santis expand his territory unchecked, and who saw in Franklin's proposal an opportunity to finally reclaim ground his family had lost. Once, Salvatore Moretti said finally, one attempt. If it fails, you're on your own, Weiss. My family won't be tied to a botched kidnapping of a De Santis wife. It was Elena who intercepted the plan first, not out of loyalty to Isabella, but out of a colder calculation entirely her own. She had spent months nursing her humiliation from the wedding, from the gala, from every quiet, cutting exchange with Isabella that had left her feeling smaller than a Moretti was ever meant to feel. But she had also, in that same span of time, watched her father's organization drift toward a partnership with a man as unstable and desperate as Franklin Weiss. And some cold, pragmatic part of her recognized the danger in that alliance long before her pride would allow her to admit any sympathy for Isabella herself. She placed the call to the De Santis penthouse from an unregistered phone, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite guilt, but occupied the same uncomfortable territory. "Your wife is in danger," Elena said without preamble, the moment Damian answered. "My father has agreed to help Franklin Weiss take her. I don't know the exact details of the plan yet, but I know it's happening soon. And I know your security will not be prepared for an operation with the resources of two families behind it instead of one." "Why are you telling me this?" Damian said, suspicion sharp in every syllable. "Because whatever I feel about you, De Santis, I am still a Moretti, and I refuse to let my father's legacy become synonymous with kidnapping women to leverage business disputes." Her voice cracked, just slightly, the first genuine emotion Damian had ever heard from her. "And because Isabella Carter looked me in the eye at a party and told me I'd never earned anything the way she earned her place beside you. And I have spent every night since then hating her for being right." The line went dead before Damian could respond, leaving him standing in his study with a piece of intelligence that could save Isabella's life, or could, just as easily, be a trap of an entirely different design. He found Isabella in the East Wing's garden room, sunlight catching the sapphire ring on her hand as she arranged flowers with the particular focus of a woman trying to keep her hands busy while her mind worked through the tangled logic of a conspiracy still unraveling around her. "We have a problem," Damian said, and watched her entire body go still with the particular readiness he had come to recognize in 5 short months as courage rather than fear. "Tell me," Isabella said, setting down the flowers, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Whatever it is, tell me all of it." The plan Damian assembled in the hours after Elena's warning required a piece of intelligence he did not yet possess, the exact date and method of the planned abduction, and the only way to acquire it in time was through a source close enough to Franklin Weiss's operation to know the details before they became irreversible. That source, devastatingly, turned out to be someone already inside the De Santis household. "It's Marisol," Enzo said, his voice carrying an anger so profound it had gone entirely flat, delivering the name of Isabella's own household assistant, a woman hired 3 months into the marriage, vetted, trusted, present for 100 quiet mornings of coffee and conversation Isabella had believed private. "She's been feeding information to Franklin Weiss since she was hired. Your schedule, your security patterns, even personal details about your marriage that Weiss has been using to understand exactly how to hurt you both." Isabella felt the betrayal land like a physical blow, worse in some ways than Marco's had been, because Marco had at least been a stranger she'd known for 8 months, rather than a woman who had brought her tea every morning and asked, with what Isabella had believed was genuine warmth, about her day. "Why?" Isabella asked, her voice hollow. "What could Franklin possibly be paying her that's worth this?" "Her brother owes money to people connected to Weiss's businesses," Enzo said. "A gambling debt, 6 figures, the kind that gets collected with violence if it isn't paid another way. Weiss offered to erase the debt in exchange for information. She's not a hardened operative, Isabella. She's a scared woman, protecting her family, the only way she saw available to her."
It should have made the betrayal easier to forgive. It didn't, not entirely, though Isabella found herself understanding it in a way she hadn't expected. A woman cornered by circumstances beyond her control, making a desperate choice that mirrored, in some distorted way, her own decision to marry a stranger at an airport, rather than face a future with nothing left to protect her. "Where is she now?" Damian asked, his voice carrying none of the mercy Isabella's had. "Confronted an hour ago. She's cooperating fully, terrified of what happens next." Enzo's jaw was tight. She confirmed the plan. They're moving on the charity gala this weekend. Isabella's schedule places her briefly alone during the silent auction portion, in a private viewing room Vice's people have already mapped. 2 teams, one from Vice's private security, one from the Moretti organization, coordinated through Salvatore Moretti directly. Damian turned to Isabella, something fierce and protective and utterly resolved settling over his features. "We're not attending the gala." "Yes, we are," Isabella said, surprising even herself with the steadiness of the words. "We know their plan now, Damian. That's an advantage most people never get. If we cancel, they'll simply try again somewhere we haven't anticipated. But if we go, on our terms, with your security prepared for exactly what's coming, we end this. Completely. Franklin Vice, the Moretti Alliance, all of it, in one night. It's too dangerous. Everything about this life is dangerous, Damian. I signed up for that the moment I put my hand in yours at that safe house." She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers, feeling the tension thrumming beneath his skin. "I won't spend the rest of our marriage hiding from every threat that comes for us. I want to fight beside you, the way I promised. Let me do that now, when it actually matters." Damian studied her for a long moment, and Isabella watched something shift behind his eyes. Not surrender exactly, but a recalibration. A man accustomed to protecting everyone around him single-handedly, slowly learning to share the weight of the battle instead. "If we do this," he said finally, "you follow every instruction Enzo gives you without hesitation. No improvisation, no heroics beyond what we plan for in advance. I already almost lost you once outside a boutique that wasn't even supposed to be dangerous. I won't survive losing you at an event I walked you into deliberately." "I promise," Isabella said. "Whatever you need." Behind them, unnoticed in the doorway, Marisol stood with Enzo's men flanking her, tears streaking a face that had aged years in the span of a single confession, watching the couple she had betrayed prepare to walk directly into the danger she had helped design. "Mrs. De Santis," Marisol said quietly, her voice breaking, "I am so sorry. I never wanted—" "I know," Isabella said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant the forgiveness in her voice, even through the hurt. "Help us stop this, and we'll help your brother. That's the only apology that matters right now." The charity gala unfolded exactly as choreographed on the surface. Champagne, string quartets, 300 guests bidding on silent auction items that would fund children's hospitals across the state, while beneath that glittering veneer, 2 opposing forces prepared to collide with a violence neither Franklin Vice nor Salvatore Moretti fully understood they were walking into. Damian's security had spent 4 days preparing the venue. Every exit mapped, every blind spot eliminated. Enzo personally overseeing a team 3 times the size anyone outside the household would notice. Isabella wore, at Damian's insistence, a discreet vest beneath her gown.
Light enough not to show, sturdy enough to buy precious seconds if the plan unravelled into gunfire. "Remember," Damian murmured against her ear as they moved through the crowd, his hand never leaving the small of her back. "The moment Enzo signals, you move directly to the service corridor behind the north wall. No hesitation." "I remember." Isabella smiled for the benefit of the guests around them, the practiced performance of a woman who had learned, over 5 months, exactly how to carry danger beneath composure. "Franklin's here already. I saw him 20 minutes ago, pretending to examine the auction items." "I saw him too." Damian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He looks like a man who believes he's about to win." The private viewing room, when Isabella made her way there precisely on schedule, alone, by design, bait in a trap Damian's people had spent days preparing, was quiet in a way that made every nerve in her body sing with awareness. She examined the auction pieces with practiced calm, aware of Enzo's team positioned in the corridor beyond, aware of Damian himself watching from the main hall's security feed, aware that the next several minutes would determine whether this conspiracy ended tonight or metastasized into something far more dangerous for everyone she loved. The door opened behind her with the particular quiet of men who believed they moved unseen. "Mrs. De Santis." Franklin Weiss's voice, when it came, carried none of the warmth she remembered from childhood dinners at her father's house. "You've caused me a considerable amount of trouble." Isabella turned slowly, keeping her expression carefully composed despite the 2 armed men flanking Franklin in the doorway. "You mean I discovered that you've been stealing from my father for years while pretending to be his friend?" "Business is business, Isabella. Your father built something extraordinary, and I simply understood better than he did how to maximize its value." Franklin's smile was cold, calculating. "You're going to come with us, quietly. Your husband will be far more reasonable once he understands the accounts I'll expose the moment anyone tries to rescue you." "I don't think so," Isabella said, and pressed the small transmitter hidden in her clutch, the signal Enzo's team had been waiting for. What happened next unfolded with the brutal, practiced efficiency of men who had spent their entire adult lives preparing for exactly this moment. Enzo's team breached the corridor within seconds, the 2 armed men flanking Franklin subdued before either could raise a weapon. Damian himself arriving through the private entrance with a fury that transformed his entire bearing into something Isabella had glimpsed only once before in an airport terminal months ago. "Franklin Weiss," Damian said, his voice carrying a lethal calm more frightening than any shout could have been. "You hired men to attack my wife. You conspired with a rival family to kidnap her from a charity event meant to help sick children. Did you truly believe I would let either of those things happen without consequences?" "You're bluffing," Franklin said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the lie even as he spoke it. "You need me alive. The accounts, the evidence I have against your organization. I have federal auditors already reviewing every account you've touched in the past 8 months, Damian said. I have your alliance with the Morettis documented in enough detail to end both your freedom and Salvatore Moretti's standing within his own organization. The only reason you're still breathing right now, Weiss, is that my wife asked me to let the law handle you rather than handling you myself." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into something colder than Isabella had ever heard from him. "Don't mistake her mercy for my own. If you ever come near her again, I will not extend the same courtesy. Federal agents, coordinated quietly by Damian's lawyers over the preceding days, working from evidence assembled through Salvatore's forensic trail, arrived within the hour to take Franklin Weiss into custody. His empire of stolen fortune and manufactured betrayal collapsing in the space of a single evening. Isabella watched from the safety of Damian's arms as Franklin Weiss was led away in handcuffs past 300 stunned gala guests, and felt, for the first time since a note had been slipped beneath a vestry door months ago, the full and final weight of justice finally settling into place. Salvatore Moretti's fall came not through arrest, but through the far more devastating currency of his own world, reputation, and its total, irrecoverable collapse. Word spread through the underground economy of families and alliances within days. Salvatore Moretti had conspired with an outside criminal to kidnap the wife of Damian De Santis, and the plan had failed so catastrophically that federal attention now circled an organization that had spent decades avoiding exactly that kind of exposure. Allied families withdrew their support one by one, unwilling to be associated with an operation whose leader had gambled recklessly and lost. Within a month, Salvatore Moretti found himself without the territories, the alliances, or the respect that had defined his family's power for 3 generations. It was Elena who came to the De Santis penthouse in the aftermath, dressed not in the weaponized crimson Isabella had come to associate with her, but in simple black, her composure stripped down to something rawer and more honest than Isabella had ever witnessed. "I came to apologize," Elena said, standing stiffly in the penthouse's entryway, clearly uncomfortable in a role she had never practiced. "Not for the things I said to you. Those were unkind, but they were mine to own, and I don't regret the honesty of my anger, even if I regret its cruelty. I came to apologize for my father, and for what my family almost helped happen to you." "You warned Damian," Isabella said. "You didn't have to do that." "No, I didn't." Elena's jaw tightened. "I've spent years believing that power was the only currency that mattered, that if I couldn't have love, I could at least have respect, position, the kind of security that comes from being feared rather than dismissed. Watching my father nearly destroy everything our family built for an alliance with a desperate small man like Franklin Weiss made me understand something I should have understood years ago." She met Isabella's eyes, something almost vulnerable flickering there. "Power without honor is just fear wearing a nicer suit. You and Damian, whatever this marriage started as, you built something with honor at its center. I resented that more than I resented you, if I'm honest." Isabella studied her for a long moment, surprised by the genuine remorse in Elena's voice. "What will you do now?" "Rebuild, quietly, on different terms than my father's. Terms that don't require kidnapping the wives of men I envy to feel powerful." A ghost of dark humor crossed Elena's face. "I hear congratulations are in order. The real wedding, not the political one." "Word travels fast. In our world, it always does." Elena hesitated at the door, something almost gentle in her expression. "For what it's worth, Isabella, I think Damian De Santis found something in you that men like him rarely find at all. Don't let anyone, including the 2 of you, convince you it wasn't worth every risk it took to get here." She left without waiting for a response, and Isabella stood in the entryway for a long moment, turning over the strange, unexpected gift of an enemy's honesty. Damian found her there minutes later, having listened to the entire exchange from the adjoining study.
"You handled that with more grace than I would have," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, chin resting against the crown of her head. She lost everything her family built in a single month. It's hard to hate someone that thoroughly humbled. Isabella turned in his arms, studying the face she had come to know so completely over 5 extraordinary, terrifying, transformative months. "Is it over, Damian? Truly over? Franklin in custody, the Morettis in collapse, Marisol's brother's debt settled, so she isn't punished for a decision made out of desperation rather than malice." "It's over," Damian confirmed, and for the first time since she had met him in a terminal drenched in gunfire and heartbreak, Isabella watched every trace of vigilance drain from his shoulders, replaced by something she had never seen in him before: rest. No more conspiracies, no more rival families circling for advantage. Just us, Isabella. Whatever comes next, it's finally, entirely, just us. "Good," Isabella said, rising onto her toes to press her mouth to his, "because I have several very specific opinions about what our second wedding should look like, and none of them involve strategic alliances or political optics." Damian laughed, a full, unguarded sound that had become less rare with every passing week, and kissed her back with a tenderness that held nothing in reserve. Marco Alvarez's arrest came 3 weeks later, in a small coastal town in Portugal where he had believed himself safely beyond the reach of both the Carter family's lawyers and whatever quiet violence he assumed Damian De Santis might eventually send after him. He had underestimated, fatally, the reach of federal law enforcement once Franklin Weiss began cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence, naming every accomplice in his scheme with the particular desperation of a man trying to save whatever remained of his freedom. Isabella learned of the arrest from Damian, delivered gently, in the quiet of their bedroom, rather than announced over breakfast like ordinary news. "They caught him," Damian said. "Federal agents, working with Interpol. He's being extradited to face charges for wire fraud, conspiracy, and his role in the attack against you at the boutique." Isabella absorbed the news slowly, testing her own reaction the way one tests a bruise to see how much it still hurts. She found, to her genuine surprise, that the wound Marco Alvarez had once carved into her had healed into something far smaller than she'd expected. Not because the betrayal mattered less, but because everything that had grown in its aftermath had rendered it almost irrelevant by comparison. "Do you want to see him?" Damian asked carefully, "before the trial? Some people need that, closure or an explanation, or simply the chance to look the person who hurt them in the eye and see that they've moved past being afraid of them." Isabella considered the question longer than she expected to need. "Yes," she said finally, "not for him. For me." The meeting, arranged through Damian's lawyers and conducted in a secure federal facility with Damian himself waiting in the adjoining room, lasted less than 10 minutes. Marco looked smaller than Isabella remembered, stripped of the charm and confidence that had once convinced her for 8 entire months that she was loved rather than surveilled. "Isabella," his voice cracked on her name, "I never meant for it to go this far. Franklin approached me with an opportunity, and I was drowning in debt, and I told myself I could walk away before it became—" "Stop," Isabella said, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her. "I didn't come here for an explanation, Marco. I came here to tell you something, and then I'm leaving, and I don't intend to think about you again after today." He fell silent,
watching her with the wary attention of a man who understood he had lost every ounce of power he'd once held over her. "You spent 8 months convincing me I was worth loving, and then you proved in a single note that you never believed it yourself," Isabella said. "For a long time, I thought that meant something was wrong with me, that I was too easy to leave, too forgettable to fight for." She straightened, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I know now that isn't true. I found a man who has fought for me every single day since the moment we met, who has never once made me question whether I was worth the risk of loving honestly. You didn't break me, Marco. You just delayed the moment I found someone who actually deserved the love I have to give." She left without waiting for his response, walking out of the facility's cold corridor into the afternoon sun, where Damian waited, his expression carefully neutral, ready to absorb whatever grief or anger the meeting had stirred loose. "How do you feel?" he asked, taking her hand. "Lighter," Isabella said, genuinely surprised by the truth of it. "I think I needed to say that to him more than I needed to hear anything from him. Closure isn't about the person who hurt you understanding what they did. It's about you finally understanding that their opinion of your worth was never accurate in the first place." Damian brought her hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, with a reverence that had become as familiar to her now as breathing. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Isabella De Santis. Stronger than any enemy I've faced, any war I've fought. I am endlessly, hopelessly grateful that fate put you in my path the day everything in your life fell apart." "Fate had excellent timing," Isabella agreed, leaning into him as they walked toward the waiting car. "Terrible circumstances, excellent timing." 6 months after the gala that ended Franklin Weiss's freedom and the Moretti Alliance's ambitions, Damian De Santis stood in the same cathedral where he had married Isabella the first time, watching her walk down an aisle toward him for the second time in less than a year, and found himself, for the first time in his adult life, entirely unprepared for the emotions swelling in his chest. This wedding was smaller, only the people who genuinely mattered, rather than the political theatre the first ceremony had required. Isabella's parents sat in the front row, her father having rebuilt what remained of his business with a humility the previous 8 months had taught him. Her mother crying openly in a way she would have considered undignified a year earlier. Salvatore stood as best man, grinning with the unguarded joy of a man who had watched his cousin transform from a fortress into a person capable of being loved. Even Enzo, standing at attention near the door out of habit rather than necessity, wiped at his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Isabella wore ivory again, simpler this time, a dress chosen entirely for herself rather than for the expectations of an audience she no longer needed to perform for. When she reached the altar, Damian took her hands in his, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply looking at each other, with the particular wonder of two people who had survived enough danger together to recognize, finally, what they had actually found. "I believe it's your turn to write your own vows this time," the officiant said gently, and Damian, who had rehearsed a dozen versions of this moment in the quiet hours of countless sleepless nights, found every prepared word abandoning him entirely in favor of something rawer and more true. "Isabella," he began, his voice steadier than he expected, given the emotion threatening to overwhelm it. A year ago, I believed love was a liability I couldn't afford, a softness that men in my world paid for with their lives. I built walls around every part of myself capable of being hurt, and I convinced myself that was strength, rather than the deepest kind of loneliness a person can carry. He tightened his grip on her hands. Then I met a woman who noticed an assassin before my own trained security did, who chose courage over safety in the worst moment of her life, and who has spent every day since then proving to me that love isn't a weakness at all. It's the only thing worth building an empire to protect. I promise you, Isabella, not for 1 year, not for politics or convenience, but for the entire rest of my life, that I will never let you stand alone again. Not against enemies, not against grief, not against the parts of yourself you're still learning to trust. I love you more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything, and I intend to spend every day proving that isn't an exaggeration. Isabella, tears streaking freely down her face now, squeezed his hands and found her own voice steadier than she expected. A year ago, I stood at an altar and learned that the person I trusted most in the world saw me as nothing more than an asset to exploit, she said. I came to an airport that day, believing I would never trust anyone again, that love was simply a mechanism other people used to take what they wanted from you. Then a stranger in a dark suit pulled me down behind a counter to shield me from gunfire, and somehow, impossibly, taught me that love could be the opposite of everything I'd learned to fear it was. Her voice broke just slightly, before steadying again. Damian De Santis, you have fought for me every single day since the moment we met. You have never once made me feel like a burden or an obligation or anything less than a person worth protecting for her own sake rather than her usefulness. I love you, not the empire, not the power, not the protection you offered me at my lowest moment. I love the man underneath all of it, the one who still can't sleep more than 4 hours a night and still drinks his coffee black because he never learned to slow down enough to add cream. I promise to keep noticing those things about you for the rest of our lives, and to never let you carry any of it alone again. The kiss that sealed their second wedding lasted considerably longer than 3 seconds, and no one in the cathedral this time was counting. 3 years later, the De Santis penthouse had changed in small, accumulating ways that told the story of everything that had happened since that rain-soaked proposal outside a closed bookshop. A child's drawings taped to the refrigerator in the kitchen where staff once prepared meals for 2 strangers learning to share a life. A small pair of shoes by the door belonging to a daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn courage. Framed photographs where sterile modern art had once hung, capturing moments too precious and too human for a house that had once felt more like a fortress than a home. Isabella stood on the terrace where Damian used to pace alone at midnight, now watching their daughter Sophia chase Enzo, reluctantly, affectionately drafted into the role of unofficial uncle, across the terrace with the particular delighted shrieking of a 2-year-old who had recently discovered the joy of being chased. "She has your instincts," Damian said, coming to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of 3 years of marriage. Noticed the delivery driver's unfamiliar face before Enzo's own security team flagged it last week. "God help us both," Isabella laughed. "A toddler who notices threats before trained professionals. We're doomed." "We're prepared," Damian corrected, though the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Which is more than either of us could say for ourselves the day we met." Below them, the city continued its endless, glittering churn, a world of power and danger and quiet negotiations that Damian still navigated daily, though with a caution and deliberation that had softened considerably since the collapse of both Franklin Weiss's schemes and the Moretti Alliance's ambitions. He had spent 3 years quietly restructuring his organization's operations, shifting further toward the legitimate businesses that had always served as its foundation, driven by a father's determination to leave his daughter a world with fewer enemies circling than the one he had inherited at 17. "Do you ever think about that day at the airport?" Isabella asked, leaning into him, watching Sophia collapse into giggles as Enzo scooped her into his arms. "Every day," Damian admitted. "I think about how close I came to never crossing paths with you at all. If my flight had boarded on schedule, if those assassins had targeted a different terminal, if you'd chosen a different departure gate to run to. An entire lifetime of happiness, built on 100 small coincidences that could have gone differently." "I don't think it was coincidence," Isabella said. "I think some part of both of us was looking for exactly what we found in each other, even before we knew we were looking. You needed someone who could see past the reputation to the person underneath. I needed someone who would never make me question my own worth again. We found each other because we needed to, not because 100 small accidents happened to align." Damian turned her gently in his arms, studying her face with the same intensity he had shown her that first night in the back of a bulletproof car, blood soaking through white silk, 2 strangers thrown together by violence and grief, who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built something extraordinary from the wreckage. "I love you, Isabella De Santis," he said, the words as natural now as breathing, stripped of all the fear that had once made them so difficult to speak aloud. "Not for 1 year, not for convenience or protection or politics, for every year we have left, and I intend for there to be many of them." "I love you too," Isabella whispered, rising onto her toes to press her mouth to his, the city glittering around them, their daughter's laughter carrying across the terrace, a family built from betrayal and gunfire, and the stubborn, unlikely courage of 2 people who had chosen, again and again, to trust each other with the most dangerous thing either of them owned, their hearts. Below them, the empire continued, quieter now, safer, built on foundations sturdier than fear. And above it all, on a terrace overlooking a city that had once nearly cost them everything, Damian De Santis and Isabella Carter finally, fully, permanently came home to each other.